In 301, the Roman state published a list of maximum prices, a last attempt to freeze an economy that was coming apart. A pound of gold was capped at 50,000 denarii. A pound of purple silk was capped at 150,000. 3 times gold, by weight, for cloth. Nothing about a silkworm explains that number. That number is a record of distance. You already know the picture that is supposed to explain it. A line drawn across the map of Asia, from the old Chinese capitals out through the desert, past Samarkand, down through Persia, arriving at the Mediterranean, camels crossing a dune at low sun. A merchant who sets out from one end of the world, and years later, walks into the other, carrying wonders. An age when the continents first reached across and touched each other, and something moved in both directions: cloth, spices, paper, faith, mathematics, curiosity as a business model. The romance of the road itself. Here is the part that sits badly under that picture. The road does not have a name until 1877. It is given one by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen, who called it the Seidenstrasse, the Silk Road, while producing an atlas of China. No Chinese, Persian, Sogdian, Greek, or Arabic source calls it anything like that, because none of them had a word for it. There was no term because there was no object. The most famous trade route in human history was named by a man in the 19th century, about 1800 years after the traffic on it began. It was not a road. There was no roadbed, no maintained surface, no agreed line, and in most places, no single direction of travel. It was not a route either, in the sense of one path that a person could follow from end to end. It was a sequence of short legs. A merchant in a given oasis city went to the market 3 or 4 weeks away, sold what he had, bought what was there, and went home. The man who bought from him did the same thing, in his own direction, on his own leg. And the leg after that, and the leg after that, out to the ends. Goods crossed the whole distance. People, as a rule, did not. Individuals occasionally did envoys, monks, a Venetian or two in the 13th century, and they are remembered precisely because they were unusual. The bulk of the traffic, the thing that actually moved tonnage and money, was a relay. It did not run east to west, either. The single arrow on the map is the second half of the error. Traffic moved north into the steppe and south into India, doubled back, sat in a warehouse for a season, and went out again in a different direction with a different owner. The densest commerce on the whole system was not intercontinental at all. It was inter-Asian, between oases a few weeks apart, and it was the substrate that the long-distance goods rode on top of, which means that every bale of silk that reached the Mediterranean had been sold, and bought, and sold again, somewhere between 10 and 30 times on the way. And every man in that chain had to eat, feed his animals, pay whoever controlled the ground he was standing on, hire someone to keep him alive, and still come out ahead, or he would not have done it at all. So the price on that Roman list is not a fact about silk. It is a fact about how many times silk had changed hands before a Roman official wrote it down. Once you can see how that number gets built, everything else about this world stops sounding like culture and starts sounding like consequence. The goods it carried, the cities that grew on it, the religions that traveled it, the strange gaps in what anyone knew, even the romance. Nobody walked the whole way. Start with the animal, because everything else is downstream of the animal. A Bactrian camel carries somewhere between 170 and 250 kilograms. That is the entire warehouse. Whatever the caravan is going to sell, it is on those backs, and there is not a great deal of it. The camel walks 30 to 40 kilometers on a good day. Not through mountains, not through soft sand, not in a bad season on a good day, on decent ground. And the camel eats. Every day, whether it's carrying anything valuable or not. So do the men leading it, and the men hired to protect it, and the horses those men are riding. Now load that camel with grain. Grain is the most important commodity in any pre-industrial society. It is the thing that decides whether a region lives. And it is worth very little per kilogram, because it is heavy and it is grown everywhere people live. You set out. The animals eat, the men eat. Every day, the load gets smaller and the distance behind you gets longer. Somewhere out there, and the exact point depends on the terrain, the season, and how much you are paying your guards, there is a distance at which the shipment has consumed itself. Not lost, not stolen. Eaten by the operation that was carrying it. Past that point, the cargo is worth less than the cost of having moved it. And no amount of demand at the far end changes the arithmetic, because the grain never gets there. That distance is short, not thousands of kilometers. Depending on conditions, a matter of dozens. And there is a second set of mouths that makes it shorter. A caravan carrying anything worth stealing has to be guarded, and every guard is a man who eats, drinks, needs a mount, needs paying, and carries nothing that can be sold at the far end. Protection is pure overhead, loaded onto the same animals. The more valuable the cargo, the more guards it justifies, and the more of its own carrying capacity it spends on not being taken, which sets up a filter, and the filter is ruthless, and it runs for centuries without anyone administering it. A commodity survives on this network if, and only if, it is worth more than the cost of moving it food, fodder, wages, protection, and every fee levied along the way compounded across the number of hands it must pass through. Nothing else gets on. Nothing else can. Silk passes. It is close to weightless, and it is priced like treasure. Pepper and other spices pass. They are dried, dense in value, and they do not spoil in a way that matters over a season. Gemstones pass. Musk passes a few grams of glandular secretion from a mountain deer, priced against its weight in metal. Fine glass passes. Gold and silver pass, obviously. Grain does not pass. Timber does not pass. Iron ore does not pass. Ordinary pottery, the kind people actually eat off, does not pass. Wine mostly does not pass. Anything ordinary, anything heavy, anything that people in the destination city could make adequately for themselves, none of it passes. It cannot cover its own carriage. So the famous list of Silk Road luxuries is not a description of taste. Nobody sat down and decided that this world would trade in silk and spice and jade because those things were beautiful. That list is the output of a filter. It is simply the set of objects whose value per kilogram was high enough to survive being carried and taxed and resold across a continent. And the same filter has one more entry, which the romance does not include. A human being is dense in value and, unlike a bale of cloth, walks. The cost of transport is close to zero, because the cargo carries itself. People pass the filter. They passed it easily. The specific name for this arrangement, in the economic literature, is a value-to-weight constraint under high transaction costs, and it explains more about the pre-modern world than any amount of description of anybody's national character. But the name came later, and it is the least useful thing about it. The useful thing is the ox that eats the grain it is pulling. Take the filter as given, and follow what it forces. The first consequence is the one already on the table. If a good must be resold 10 or 20 or 30 times, and every seller takes a margin, and every crossing point takes a fee, then the price at the destination is dominated by the chain, not by production. A weaver in Han or Tang, China, is producing cloth at a cost that has some relationship to mulberry leaves, worm rearing, labor, and time. By the point, a Roman official is capping purple silk at 150,000 denarii a pound, while capping gold at 50,000. The weaver's costs are a rounding error inside that figure. Almost all of it is accumulated distance margin stacked on toll. And that is before the last gate. Roman goods coming from the east through the Red Sea ports, at Berenike and Myos Hormos, were assessed at Koptos and charged a duty called the tetar. A quarter, 25% of the assessed value, taken at a single crossing, with the possibility of a further levy at Alexandria for anything moving on into the wider empire. Hold that rate against the structure. That is one gate, at the very end of the journey, in the most administratively organized state on the route. Now think about how many gates there were between the Tarim Basin and the Mediterranean, held by how many different authorities, each with its own idea of what it was owed. There is a document that shows the scale this ran at. A papyrus now in Vienna records a loan and a cargo, a ship called the Hermopolitan, sailing from Muziris on the Malabar coast to Berenike in the 2nd century. The manifest includes something on the order of 4 tons of ivory, alongside pepper and textiles. Reconstructions of the total value vary between scholars, but they land in the millions of sesterces for a single hull. One ship's paperwork, describing a cargo worth more than the annual pay of a substantial body of Roman troops. Let that land. There is a temptation to reach for the biggest number in the field here, and it is worth resisting out loud. Pliny the Elder wrote that 100 million sesterces a year drained out of Rome to India, China, and Arabia. It is the most quoted figure about this trade, and it turns up in almost every popular account. It should not carry as much weight as it does. Pliny produces it inside a passage, complaining about luxury and about what women spend on ornament. It is a moralist's number, deployed in a moral argument. Some historians read it as a genuine signal of a real trade imbalance, supported by the Roman gold that keeps turning up in hordes across southern India. Others treat it as rhetoric with a decimal point. The honest position is that we do not know what Pliny's 100 million is measuring. But we do not need it. The customs rate is documented. The manifest is documented. A 25% duty at one gate and a single ship carrying value in the millions tell you everything the moralist number was gesturing at, and they tell it on evidence that holds. And the filter's last entry has names attached to it. A contract survives from the Astana cemetery at Turfan, written in Sogdian, dated 639. It records the sale of a girl called Upak. The seller named in the document is her father, Wakushvert. The price is 120 Persian silver drachms. Another record, from 731, has a man in Chang'an buying an 11-year-old girl from a Sogdian merchant. The price is 40 bolts of silk. Note what she is priced in, not coin, silk. The commodity that best survived the transport filter had become the money of the route, and that is what a child cost, quoted in it. There is no account of this trade that is complete without those documents. They are not an aberration inside the system. They are the system's own filter, applied to people, and the filter did not distinguish. Here is the problem this creates for everyone living inside it. You are handing goods worth a fortune to a man you may see twice in your life, in a place where no court has authority over both of you, under no sovereign who governs both ends of the transaction. There is no contract law that spans Sogdiana and Gansu. There is no police force that will pursue a debt across the Taklamakan on your behalf. If he takes your consignment and disappears, there is no mechanism, none that returns it. And yet the trade ran, in some form, for well over 1,000 years, which means something was doing the work that courts and banks do now, and it had to be built out of whatever was locally available. Start with the buildings. Across Anatolia and Iran, and in various forms further east, the route is punctuated by caravanserais fortified stone compounds with water, stabling, storerooms, a place to sleep, a place to pray, and walls. In the Seljuk network, they sit roughly 30 to 40 kilometers apart. That is not an aesthetic decision. That is one day's travel, converted into architecture. The spacing of those buildings is the walking range of a loaded camel, made permanent in stone. The infrastructure of the route was not built around where anyone wanted to go. It was built around how far you could get before dark, and a good many of them were free to use. In the Seljuk and later Ottoman systems, caravanserais were commonly endowed as charitable foundations, offering lodging, food, and stabling for a fixed number of nights at no charge to the traveler, which sounds like piety, and partly was, and is also a subsidy. A ruler who wants traffic through his territory, because traffic is what he taxes, has an obvious interest in making sure the traffic survives the night. The free bed and the toll gate are two ends of the same policy. Then, the people. In 1907, in the ruins of a watchtower about 90 kilometers west of Dunhuang, R.L. Stein found a set of letters in Sogdian, written around the year 313, apparently the contents of a mailbag that never arrived. They are not literature. One of them, from a commission agent named Nanai Vandak, is addressed to his partners in Samarkand, roughly 2,000 miles west of where he was sitting. He writes about debts that have not been paid, goods that have not arrived, and a business partner who went to India and has not come back. That is the oldest surviving voice on this route, and he is complaining about money he is owed. What that mailbag actually documents is an enforcement system. The Sogdians, an Iranian-speaking people from the region around Samarkand and Bukhara, ran resident communities in city after city, from Sogdiana across the Tarim Basin into China. Kinship, a shared language, shared religious institutions, and a very small world in which everyone's conduct was known. You could extend credit to a man 1,000 miles away, because both of you belonged to something that could throw you out, and being thrown out meant you were finished. Reputation was not a soft asset. It was the collateral. It is not so different from a correspondent banking relationship, in which one institution honors another's claim because both are inside a system that can expel them. Though the modern version has a regulator behind it, and the Sogdians had only each other, and then money itself had to be improvised. In the Turfan oasis, across several centuries, bolts of silk functioned as currency. Not a metaphor, silk was the unit that prices were quoted in and debts were settled with, which is elegant and grim, and completely logical. Coin is heavy, and its value is local. Silk is light, durable, universally wanted, and worth a great deal per kilogram. The commodity that passed the transport filter best became the money, because money has to travel too. Nobody walked the whole way, so the whole way had to be assembled out of people who stayed put. Now the harder question, and the one that turns this from an interesting fact into a cost. Not what this network did, what it made impossible. Bulk trade could not exist. That follows directly from the animal eating the cargo, and its consequences run deep. Regional specialization in staples could not happen. In the modern world, a region with the right soil becomes a supplier for a continent and buys everything else. Here that trade cannot be executed. A region good at growing grain can feed itself and its neighbors, and that is the end of the market, so nearly every settlement has to produce most of what it consumes, whether or not it is any good at it. Famine relief across the network could not happen. The route that could move a pound of silk 4,000 miles could not move a ton of wheat 300. Surplus in one place and starvation in another could sit on the same map in the same decade, joined by a working trade network, and nothing could pass between them because the only things this network could carry were things the starving could not eat. It is worth being straight about how much traffic there was at all. Valerie Hansen, working from the documents recovered at Turfan and Dunhuang, has argued that the long-distance luxury trade was considerably smaller than the popular picture suggests. A market register from Turfan, dated 743, lists what was actually for sale, and it is overwhelmingly local. Her argument is that the biggest economic engine in the region was not private commerce, but Chinese government spending, with the Tang state shipping bolts of silk to its frontier garrisons as pay, precisely because silk was lighter than coin. Not everyone accepts that. Plenty of historians think she has understated the private trade, and the argument is live. But even the version that disagrees with her does not restore the road. It raises the volume moving through the relay. The relay is not in dispute. And there is one more thing the structure made impossible, which is the quietest and the most consequential. Nobody could know both ends. The man selling raw silk in a market in the Tarim Basin had no idea what it eventually sold for in Antioch, and could not have found out. The only people who could have carried that information back were the people with the least reason to. And the buyer in Antioch had no idea what it cost at the source. The proof is sitting in Roman literature. Virgil wrote that the Sares, the silk people, somewhere far to the east, combed silk from the leaves of trees. Pliny repeated a version of it. The wealthiest men in the Mediterranean were paying more than the price of gold for a fabric, and their best available account of where it came from was that it grew. That is not stupidity, and it is not credulity. It is the exact shape of a supply chain long enough that the information dies before it reaches the end. In the year 97, a Han officer named Gan Ying was sent west to make contact with Da Qin Rome. He got as far as the Western Sea, and the sailors there told him the crossing could take 2 years, that men had died of longing on the way. He turned back. The two empires never met. Those sailors were subjects of Parthia, which sat between the two ends, and profited from the fact that neither could reach the other. Whether they said it in order to keep things that way is not recorded, and historians who assert it are going past the source. But motive is not the point. The structure produced that outcome, whether anyone intended it or not, because there was nobody in that chain whose interest was served by the two ends meeting. Go back to the picture at the start and take it apart, piece by piece. The romance of the caravan, the single heroic journey across a continent, there was no such journey to be romantic about. The image was assembled in 19th century Europe, out of fragments of Marco Polo and a geographer's coinage, at exactly the moment when European powers were building railways and steamship lines, and were extremely interested in the idea of a great transcontinental artery. The romance is not a memory of the thing. It is a projection onto it, and it is about 150 years old. The mystique of the East, the sense that these goods came from somewhere unreachable and half imaginary, and carried something of that with them. That is not a cultural attitude. That is what a supply chain produces at its far end when nobody can see back down it. Mystique is the name we give to missing supplier information. The silk tree is not a charming error, it is the information gap, drawn to scale. The great cultural exchange. Religions, alphabets, techniques, moving across Asia along with the goods. That happened, and it mattered enormously. But it did not happen because this was an age of openness. It happened because relay trade structurally requires resident foreign communities. You cannot run a chain of short legs without permanent people in every link. Sogdian colonies existed from Samarkand to Chang'an because the arithmetic demanded that somebody live there. Buddhism, Manichaeism, Nestorian Christianity, and the alphabets that carried them moved along a network of people who had settled for commercial reasons and brought their institutions with them. The exchange rode on the settlement, and the settlement was a transport cost. And the luxury itself, silk, spice, jade, musk, read as evidence of a decadent age with expensive taste. That list was not chosen. It is the residue of the filter. Those are simply the objects whose value per kilogram was high enough to survive the trip. The taste came afterward, and it formed around what was available. There is a fifth piece, And it is the one that gets the ending wrong. The overland trade is usually said to have declined because Europeans grew bold and sailed around it, an age of initiative replacing an age of stagnation, with the implication that the men on the land routes lacked the nerve to think of something better. Nerve had nothing to do with it. Those merchants would have moved their cargo by water the moment water was cheaper, and in every place where water was already available, they already had. The overland relay did not fail a test of character. It stopped being the least expensive way to move a price gap, and the traffic went where the arithmetic went, which is what the traffic had been doing the entire time. One thing needs saying, so that this does not curdle into something dumber than the romance it replaces. The constraint decided what was possible. It did not decide what anyone did inside it. Nothing in the arithmetic of transport costs required the Sogdians to build a reputational system durable enough to move credit across 2,000 miles. A network of pure extraction was equally available and considerably easier. And other people in other places built exactly that. Nothing required the Tang state to pay its garrisons in a fabric rather than starving them. The physics set the boundary of the possible. Human beings still chose where inside it to stand, and some of those choices were remarkable. Nobody walked the whole way. That is not a missing detail in the story. That is the story, the reason the goods were what they were, the reason the cities were where they were, and the reason nobody at either end knew what they were looking at. So what changed? Two things, and neither of them was anyone becoming wiser. The first was temporary, and it is worth seeing, because it shows the mechanism moving. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Mongol expansion put an enormous stretch of the route under one authority. The number of separate powers charging at the gate collapsed. And almost immediately, a Florentine banker named Francesco Balducci Pegolotti compiled a merchant's handbook that included practical instructions for the journey from Tana, on the Black Sea, to Cathay. He advises hiring a good interpreter and not economizing on him, because what you save on a bad one, you lose elsewhere. He gives capacities: an ox wagon takes 10 canters, a camel wagon 30, a horse wagon 6.5 canters of silk. He tells you to carry 25 days' provisions for the first leg. He estimates expenses at 60 to 80 sami of silver for an outbound trip carrying goods worth around 25,000 florins. And he opens with this: the road you travel from Tana to Cathay is perfectly safe, whether by day or by night, according to what the merchants say who have used it. Read that last clause again. It is doing a great deal of work. Pegolotti never made the journey. He was compiling other men's accounts into a reference book, and he was careful enough to say so inside the sentence. Even the most confident surviving statement about safety on this route is secondhand, and admits it. Then the Mongol structure fragmented plague moved along the same network the goods did. The gates multiplied again, and the window closed. The permanent change was the sea. A ship carries what several hundred camels carry, and a ship does not eat. The crew eats, and the crew does not grow. With the cargo double the hold, and you do not double the sailors. That single difference destroys the value-to-weight filter. Suddenly, bulk goods can move: grain, timber, sugar, or ordinary manufactured things. There is a second difference, and it does the other half of the work. Every 100 miles of land has an owner, and owners charge. Open water has none. A hull that leaves one port and arrives at another has passed no gates, paid no transit dues, and been resold 0 times in between. The two costs that had defined overland trade for 1,000 years, the toll and the handoff, do not have a marine equivalent. They simply stop applying. The monsoon routes across the Indian Ocean had been running on this principle for centuries. What the Cape route after 1498 did was extend it around the entire landmass, and in doing so, it collapsed the number of times a cargo had to be bought and sold between origin and destination from dozens down toward one. Nobody became more enlightened. Nobody's character improved. One number changed. How many hands a thing had to pass through to get where it was going. Everything else followed from that. The shape of this problem has not gone anywhere. Take any complex product on a shelf and trace it backward. Raw material, primary processing, component manufacture, subassembly, final assembly, export agent, importer, distributor, wholesaler, retailer. Each tier prices its output to cover its costs and its margin. Each tier knows its immediate supplier and its immediate customer, and past that, the picture goes dark. The person who dug the ore has no idea what the finished object retails for. The person who buys the finished object has no idea what was paid at the beginning, and generally no idea what the beginning even was. The number on the tag encodes the length of that chain at least as much as the cost of making the thing. That is the same arithmetic, and it is worth naming as the same arithmetic. But the analogy breaks, and it breaks somewhere specific. A modern firm can buy visibility into its own supply chain. It is expensive, and it is often unpleasant, and plenty of firms decline to do it, but the information exists. It is recorded on invoices, customs filings, bills of lading, and shipping manifests. It sits in databases. In a growing number of jurisdictions, some of it must be disclosed by law. When a modern supply chain is opaque, that opacity is a choice somebody made, or a cost somebody declined to pay, and it can in principle be undone. On the route from Sogdiana to Antioch in the 3rd century, nobody was concealing the price at the far end. It had never been assembled by anyone, anywhere. There was no document to subpoena, no ledger to open, no party who held the answer and would not share it. The information did not exist in the world. That is the difference between opacity by design and opacity by physics. And it is the whole gap between that world and this one. You can hold a phone and look up what a commodity is trading for at its source, right now, on the other side of the planet, for free, in about 4 seconds. Every merchant in this story would have traded a substantial portion of his working life for that capability, and none of them could have bought it at any price, because it was not for sale. It did not exist. None of this makes the people in it smaller. Reading a price gap across 400 kilometers of desert, with no market data, no reliable news, no way to verify anything you have been told, and no recourse if you are wrong, and being right often enough to stay solvent for a working lifetime is not a lesser skill than modern arbitrage. It is arguably a harder one. The romance gets these people wrong in both directions. It makes them adventurers when they were operators, and it makes them naive when they were reading the only signal available with real precision. They were not moving cargo across a continent. Almost none of them ever saw a continent. Each one was executing a single leg, buying at one price and selling at another a few weeks away, and taking the difference. What looks from a distance like a great artery of civilization was, at ground level, thousands of people each doing something small and local and entirely rational. And when you stack all of those small local decisions end to end, what emerges is not a road. What emerges is a mechanism for converting the distance between two prices into a series of profits, distributed across everyone standing in between, none of whom could see more than a few weeks in either direction. The Silk Road never carried goods across Asia. It carried the gap between two prices, and that gap was the only thing that ever made it the whole way across. That is what it cost to move an object. Next time, what it cost to keep an army standing still, and why medieval campaigns tended to end on a calendar rather than on a battlefield.